Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. So good morning, and thank you for joining our Junior in Energy In-House Lawyers webinar series. My name is Wenzo Shah, and I am a Senior Associate in the Construction and Projects team here at Burness Paull. Today, I will be joined by my colleague, David Sharkey, who is an Associate in our Construction and Projects team. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Once you have joined, please ensure that your mute button has been selected to limit background noise. Please know that today's webinar won't be interactive, so please do contact either of us or any of your Burness Paull contacts with follow-up questions. Our contact details will be provided at the end of this webinar and will be available at the end of the slides. Today's webinar will be recorded, and if you have any queries on that, please do check out our privacy policy, which is available on Burness Paull's website. You will receive the recording over the course of the next day or so. So welcome again, everyone. This training session today is designed to give junior in-house lawyers a clear, practical framework for understanding why construction contract choice matters in energy projects and how best to approach that choice. Many lawyers will encounter construction contracts only after a form has already been selected, often focusing on amendments rather than the strategic decision that comes first. This session deliberately starts earlier in the life cycle, explaining how the selection of a standard form can shape risk allocation, pricing, program certainty, and relationships across the supply chain. We will begin by explaining why standard form contracts exist at all and linking this to efficiency, market familiarity, and where relevant, lender expectations. We will then explore why contract choice is particularly important in the energy sector, where projects are capital intensive, technically complex, and often exposed to regulatory interface and supply chain risk. A key theme throughout is perspective, how the decision looks when you're an in-house lawyer at a developer proposing a contract to the market versus when you sit within the supply chain and must price, deliver, and potentially subcontract under that form. We will then introduce the main families of construction contracts commonly encountered in energy projects, including FIDIC, NEC, LOGIC, IChemE, and JCT, explaining at a high level what each suite is designed to do and when it is most appropriately used. Finally, we'll talk about the key factors to assist you in narrowing down the right choice before closing with practical pointers about amendments and the importance of specialist advice. By the end of the session, we hope that you will feel equipped to ask the right questions internally and spot misalignments early. Why do standard form contracts exist? These exist to address recurring commercial and legal issues in a consistent and efficient manner across the construction energy sectors. Rather than negotiating every project from a blank page, parties will rely on forms that have been developed, refined, and tested over decades of use. One of the primary drivers for standard forms is market familiarity. Contractors, developers, lenders, and advisors understand how these contracts are intended to operate, which reduces uncertainty and allows pricing and risk assessments to be based upon experience rather than speculation. Another key function of standard forms is that they embed a recognized approach to risk allocation. Each form reflects an industry-accepted balance of responsibility for issues such as design, delay, change, and payment, even though no form is entirely neutral. This predictability supports more accurate pricing and reduces the need for excessive contingencies. In the energy sector, investability is a further critical factor. Developers and, where applicable, external funders are often more comfortable with recognized forms such as FIDIC and NEC because they provide a well-understood mechanisms for certification, claims, and dispute resolution. Using unfamiliar or heavily bespoke contracts can increase due diligence requirements or even affect funding terms. Standard forms also promote efficiency by reducing negotiation time and cost, even where amendments are required, which they almost always are. Finally, because these contracts have been stress tested through real projects and disputes, their core mechanisms are generally robust. They've been refined over different iterations and will often come with published guidance notes for preparing and then managing the contract. For you as in-house lawyers, understanding why standard forms exist help explain why contract choice is not simply a legal preference, but a commercial signal that shapes how a project is procured and delivered. I will now hand over to David to explain why contract choice matters.
Thanks, Wenzel. So why does it matter which contract you choose? The choice of construction contract is one of the most influential decisions made at the outset of an energy project, often having a greater impact on outcomes than later drafting amendments. At its core, the contract determines how risk is allocated between the parties, including who bears responsibility for design, unforeseen conditions, change, and delay. These decisions directly influence pricing, as contractors will price risk differently depending on whether it is retained, shared, or transferred. By way of example, a lump sum turnkey EPC style contract, whereby the contractor undertakes engineering, procurement, and construction, may offer the employer high cost and program certainty. However, that certainty is reflected in a higher contract price as the contractor prices that transferred risk in. By contrast, you may have a more collaborative structure, under which the developer places all of the key packages with individual providers itself, rather than through a single EPC contractor. Or you may have a reimbursable payment structure. These structures may reduce the upfront cost, but they require greater employer involvement and tolerance for variability. Quite often, that will be a choice driven by factors such as the technology being procured and the parties' bargaining positions. True single contract EPC projects are increasingly rare nowadays, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your project needs to sit at the opposite end of the spectrum. Contract choice also drives delivery behavior. Some forms encourage early identification and mitigation of risk, whilst others are more claims-driven and retrospective in nature. These behavioural differences matter significantly on energy projects, where regulatory milestones, grid connection dates, and subsidy deadlines can be critical. The contract also shapes the disputes profile of the project. Contracts that promote early communication and structured risk management may reduce formal disputes, whereas more adversarial models can lead to issues being crystallized late, often long after positions have hardened. For in-house lawyers, the key insight is that contract choice is not simply about legal drafting style. It establishes the incentives and behaviours that will govern the project throughout its life cycle. It may well also be for you, in your role as an in-house lawyer, to advise your business when issues arise during the contract. So understanding which contract you are choosing and why is key to being able to successfully navigate and respond to these issues effectively. To expand on contract choice further, we thought that it would be worthwhile touching upon the different perspectives that we may have in the audience this morning. From a developer's perspective, proposing the right standard form is a form of market signalling. It demonstrates experience and an understanding of sector norms. Using a familiar and appropriate contract can attract a wider pool of bidders, encourage competitive pricing, and reduce resistance during negotiations. Funders also take comfort from recognised forms, as they can more easily assess downside risk and available remedies. Conversely, proposing an unusual or poorly suited contract can raise concerns about capability, lead to extensive pushback, or result in contractors pricing in significant contingencies. From the contractor's perspective, familiarity is closely linked to pricing confidence. Contractors prefer forms that they know because they understand how risk is allocated, how claims are managed, and how payment flows operate. Familiar contracts also make it easier to subcontract work on a back-to-back basis, which reduces downstream risk. When faced with heavily bespoke or unfamiliar contracts, contractors may adopt a defensive approach, increasing prices or adopting claims-driven behaviours. For in-house lawyers working either within a developer or the supply chain, appreciating these perspectives helps inform advice on whether a proposed contract is likely to support collaboration or generate friction. The overarching lesson is that contract choice affects behaviour across the entire delivery chain, not just the legal position of the immediate parties. We've included on this slide the main standard form contracts that we see used in energy projects. You'll see that rather than these being singular contracts, they are actually each a family of contracts. I'll now hand back to Wenzel, who will discuss the first of these families of standard forms, the FIDIC suite.
Thank you, David. So we're going to start our journey through the standard forms with FIDIC and its Rainbow Suite. Before looking at the Rainbow Suite itself, what actually is FIDIC? FIDIC is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, which is a global organization that represents consulting engineers and construction professionals. And one of its most influential roles is publishing standard form construction contracts. The term Rainbow Suite refers to the family of FIDIC contracts, each color representing a different procurement model and risk allocation. This allows parties to select a contract that aligns with how responsibility is divided, particularly who designs the works and who carries the key risks. At one end, you have the red book, where the employer retains most of the design responsibility. Moving along the spectrum, the yellow book introduces contractor design responsibility. At the far end, the silver book is a turnkey model where most risk sits with the contractor. There are other colors, as you'll see from the slides, in the rainbow, but for energy projects, we typically see these being the forms adopted by developers. So the rainbow is really a visual shorthand for different approaches to risk allocation and project delivery. And this spectrum allows parties to select a form that broadly matches how responsibility is intended to be divided. The modern FIDIC suite is largely based on the 1999 editions, which for many years were the standard forms used globally. Second editions of the red, yellow, and silver books were published in 2017. It's fair to say, however, the adoption of 2017 forms has been a bit slower, certainly for offshore wind projects, with some developers continuing to procure on the 1999 editions, and the yellow book still being the most popular starting point. We are now, however, seeing more developers start to adopt the newer edition. It's worth noting also that due to the heavy adoption of FIDIC contracts on offshore wind projects, a specific offshore wind form of contract was proposed and was intended to be released towards the end of 2025. However, we're still awaiting this form. FIDIC contracts occupy a dominant position in international energy and infrastructure projects and are often regarded as the global default standard. They're widely recognized by governments, multilateral banks, and contractors worldwide. This makes them especially suitable when parties are from different jurisdictions, which is why we see it being used in, for example, 80 to 90% of offshore wind projects, where the supply chain is particularly international. We also see FIDIC widely used in power generation, other forms of renewable energy, transmission, and international oil and gas projects. One of FIDIC's key strengths is its bankability. Lenders are familiar with its risk allocation, claims mechanisms, and dispute resolution processes. And in fact, major financing institutions, for example, the World Bank and ADB, will often require or prefer FIDIC-based contracts. The role of the engineer as an independent contract administrator is another defining feature, providing a structured approach to certification and claims assessment. However, FIDIC is often perceived as more formal and claims-driven than other forms, requiring disciplined contract administration. For you as in-house lawyers, the key is to understand when this structure is a benefit, providing clarity and predictability, and when it may feel burdensome. In international or multi-jurisdictional energy projects, that structure is often precisely what makes FIDIC the preferred choice. Bear in mind, though, that for certain packages for your project, such as minor civils works, these forms will be less familiar to those contractors, and so insisting upon them may narrow down your pool of bidders. One point I will highlight, and is true for each of the standard forms we'll cover in this session, is that we never see these forms used without amendment. The degree of amendment required will depend on the project requirements and the party's appetite for risk, but it is not uncommon to see contracts which are based on the FIDIC Yellow Book resemble far closer to the FIDIC Silver Book post-amendment.
The next suite of contracts we'll look at are the NEC contracts, which stand for the New Engineering Contract. NEC contracts are a family of contracts developed in the UK by the Institution of Civil Engineers, which have become increasingly prominent in the UK energy sector, particularly for infrastructure and energy transition projects. NEC was first released in 1993, with multiple editions following, and with NEC 4 being the latest edition in 2017. The NEC contracts were developed with a purpose of fixing problems in traditional contracts, such as adversarial behaviour, poor communication, and late dispute resolution. As such, and unlike more traditional forms, NEC is designed to act as a project management tool promoting collaboration, transparency, and proactive risk management. Central to this approach is the early warning mechanism, which requires parties to notify potential risks as soon as they are identified, and the requirement to maintain an accepted programme against which compensation events are assessed. This encourages problems to be addressed early rather than crystallising into claims, which sits somewhat in contrast with FIDIC. It also uses simple language in an attempt to make it more straightforward for those administering the contract to follow. Some of you may find this unusual if you've not worked with NEC before, as it does look a bit different to more traditional contracts. The contracts themselves are a modular system with core clauses and then main options A to F, which offer flexible pricing options, including lump sum, target cost, and cost reimbursable models. This allows employers to choose an approach that reflects project maturity and risk profile, whether this is an option A fixed price with activity schedule, option C target cost, or option E cost reimbursable, while still keeping the same core clauses of the contract. This is in contrast with FIDIC, where the different forms within the Rainbow Suite are driven more by the scope of works, rather than pricing and risk. There are then secondary options, which allow parties to make other risk allocation tweaks, such as price adjustment for inflation, delay liquidated damages, limitations of liability, and so on. Beyond that, there are dispute resolution options providing for adjudication or a dispute avoidance board, with different adjudication procedures depending on whether or not the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act 1996 applies to the party's contract, which it may or may not do depending on the exact scope of works being carried out. NEC's collaborative ethos aligns well with complex energy projects where uncertainty is inevitable, such as grid updates, renewable energy infrastructure, and green hydrogen schemes. However, NEC places greater demands on the employer, who must actively manage the project and the contract through the project manager role. For organisations with strong in-house capability and experience of operating NEC contracts, this can be a significant advantage. For others, it may require additional support. Understanding this cultural and operational shift is key for in-house lawyers advising on NEC contracts. We would also note that NEC has traditionally been popular with local authorities in procuring public sector projects and UK infrastructure, such as rail, harbour works, highways, and hospitals, which can also include some form of energy centre. Its alignment with UK government policy and its adaptability across different pricing mechanisms make it a popular option for domestic energy projects. A third family of contracts is iChemE, provided by the Institution of Chemical Engineers. iChemE contracts occupy a specialist but important niche within the energy sector, particularly for projects involving complex process plant and performance guarantees. Unlike traditional contracts, iChemE forms are fundamentally performance-based, rather than focusing on whether the plant meets specified output criteria, rather than simply whether it has been built in accordance with drawings. This makes them particularly well suited to projects such as waste-to-energy schemes, combined heat and power installations, carbon capture, and petrochemical plants. iChemE contracts place significant emphasis on testing, commissioning, and acceptance procedures, reflecting the operational realities of process plant. They're available in lump sum, reimbursable, and target cost variants, providing flexibility in pricing structure. Akin to FIDIC, iChemE provides a range of contract forms. The core iChemE contracts are structured primarily around different pricing and risk allocations. The Red Book is a lump sum or fixed price contract with high contractor risk suited to well-defined delivery. The Green Book is a reimbursable or cost-plus contract, typically used for projects with greater uncertainty, and the Burgundy Book is a target cost contract with shared pain gain mechanisms to support collaborative delivery. These are all turnkey contracts intended to be used for projects which are turned over to the buyer in a ready-to-use condition. A newer form to the market is the iChemE Blue Book from 2023, which sets out an engineering, procurement, and construction management, or EPCM, contract model, where the contractor acts primarily as a manager rather than delivering the physical works. The employer holds the trade contracts directly, and the EPCM contractor coordinates design, procurement, and construction activities. Crucially, and unlike turnkey forms such as the red, green, or burgundy books, the EPCM contractor does not take on delivery risk for the works being carried out by the trade contractors, meaning that performance, cost, and schedule risks largely remain with the employer. This structure provides greater flexibility and transparency, but with increased client risk and involvement. Similar to NEC, iChemie offers flexibility in how pricing and risk are allocated, particularly through its alternative commercial models, lump sum, reimbursable, and target cost. However, iChemie contracts are less widely understood outside of specialist process industry sectors, and their use may require careful explanation to funders and stakeholders. They are therefore most suitable for projects and supply chains familiar with these forms. For appropriate process plant projects, iChemie contracts can provide closer alignment between contractual obligations and operational performance requirements than more generic construction forms, reflecting their performance-based design. iChemie contracts are used within the UK and internationally, with international versions of the red, green, burgundy, and yellow books also available.
Moving on to logic contracts, these are widely used in the oil and gas sector, particularly in the UK continental shelf, but have made their way into some offshore wind projects too. FIDIC remains the dominant form in that space, but some developers and suppliers prefer the logic form, having used them in oil and gas. A key attribute is that these contracts are service-based rather than designed for full EPC delivery. This makes them particularly suitable for operational and maintenance phases of energy assets rather than new build mega projects, and a useful suite of contracts to use alongside, for example, FIDIC contracts. In offshore wind, we would, for example, commonly see logic contracts used to procure geophysical and geotechnical packages, with FIDIC contracts used for the construction phase packages. One of the most important features is the knock-for-knock liability regime, where each party is responsible for its own personnel and property losses regardless of fault. This approach is critical in offshore environments where risks are high and complex to manage. And in fact, going back to FIDIC, we've seen that approach to knock-for-knock liability transplanted into those forms when they are used in offshore wind. Logic contracts are also designed to support framework agreements, allowing operators to engage contractors on a long-term basis with standard terms and agreed call-off mechanisms. In practice, they are most commonly used in offshore operations, including maintenance, subsea, and marine activities, or in the oil and gas space, on well services such as drilling and intervention. We typically see English law selected as the governing law where offshore services are being procured under a logic, regardless of the location of the project. However, while we do see logic used internationally, it's most familiar to those parties which have operated in the UK continental shelf. We've now reached our final family of contracts. JCT contracts and their Scottish forms, SPCC, are, while ubiquitous in the UK building sector, tend to appear less often on energy projects in our experience. And it's not a form which would be appropriate for use internationally without significant amendment. Where they are used, it's more likely to be on more minor civils and building elements, such as access roads or offices, where developers are trying to avoid limiting the bidder pool by using more specialized forms like FIDIC. While familiar to many UK contractors, JCT contracts lack the detailed mechanisms needed to manage the technical, operational, and interface risks inherent in most energy projects. For this reason, they should be used cautiously and only where the scope genuinely aligns with building type works. Now that we've covered the main standard form contracts, how do we narrow down the right construction contract for your energy project? The first key factor to consider is project type. This is often the starting point. And as we've covered, infrastructure, offshore works, and process plants will each have distinct risk profiles and market norms. Geography is another consideration and equally important. With international projects or projects with a global supply chain often pointing towards FIDIC and UK-based projects favouring NEC. This is key when considering bankability and your target bidder pool. Scale and complexity also matter. Large, complex projects with significant interface risk may benefit from contracts that provide strong governance and change management mechanisms. Pricing structures and procurement routes should also be considered at the outset, as these may impact specific contract choice and are inseparable from risk appetite. As already mentioned, an EPC style contract may offer the employer a high degree of cost and program certainty, but this is often reflected in a higher contract price, with the contractor pricing for the transferred risk. Conversely, a structure where the developer places all of the key packages with individual providers rather than through a single EPC contractor or even a reimbursable payment structure may reduce upfront cost, but the trade-off is that it requires greater employer involvement and tolerance for cost variability. Organizational capability is also a critical consideration. Collaborative contracts such as NEC can deliver significant benefits, but require active contract management and cultural buy-in. The contract management demands placed on an employer in such a contract must be properly considered at the outset, as this will ultimately impact the contract behaviours for the life of the project. Finally, the complexity of testing, commissioning, and operational performance requirements may point towards specialist forms such as IChemE. For you, as in-house lawyers, it is important to challenge assumptions and consider whether a contract form is chosen based on familiarity rather than project reality. And it's your job to ensure that contract selection supports rather than undermines project objectives.
A final but important point, which Wenzo touched on earlier, is that no standard form construction contract is typically entered into without amendment. Amendments are the norm, particularly in energy projects with unique technical, regulatory, or financing requirements. However, there is a balance to be struck here. Excessive or poorly considered amendments can undermine the logic of the standard form, create internal inconsistencies, and increase dispute risk. This is particularly true where amendments are made without a clear understanding of how the contract is intended to operate. For this reason, it is often worth obtaining specialist advice when drafting or reviewing amendments, especially for complex or high-value projects. To round up, the key takeaways from this session are firstly, that there is no one-size-fits-all contract for energy projects. Secondly, that market norms matter. And that thirdly, contract choice is a strategic risk allocation tool rather than purely a legal exercise. By engaging with contract selection and understanding the strengths and limitations of the main standard forms, in-house lawyers can play a meaningful role in setting projects up for successful delivery and avoiding problems down the line.
And that now brings us to the end of today's session. But if you'd like to hear more about any of the topics covered today, or if you have any specific queries for us, please do reach out to one of the team. We'd be delighted to hear from you. You can find our details on the slide here. As discussed, our session today has been recorded and you will receive an email with a link to the recording of the session by early next week. Our upcoming sessions are shown on the slide. Following a short summer break, our next session will be What's New in Energy Consenting on the 26th of August. Please do use the link provided to check out our next session and book your place in advance. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at our future sessions.